Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jen Fagan-Fry. I am with the NOAA Central Library. I am the NOAA Institutional Repository Manager. I am going to be your presenter today and your co-host. Our other co-host is Katie Rowley, our outreach and reference and research librarian. She will be monitoring our chat and the question box today. So if you have any questions as I go throughout the presentation, please enter them into one of those two options. We will try to answer them at the end of this session. We are recording the session today, so it will be available via the library's YouTube channel. Usually it takes us a couple days to get that up, but we will have it available there so you can share it with your colleagues who are not able to join us today. This is part of our NOAA Publishing NOAA Series, where we've been covering just some different issues related to publishing, such as the IR, open access. Today we are going to be talking about predatory publishing and specifically predatory journals. Next month we have yet another session. We can get into that a little bit later. So with that, I'm just going to dive right into the presentation. And again, if you have questions as I go, please enter them into the question panel or the chat, and we will get to them at the end. So what is predatory publishing? There isn't really a formal or official definition of what predatory publishing is, but it's generally understood to be exploiting and profiting off of the open access publishing model. So that's why last month when we talked about open access, I briefly touched on predatory publishing because they sort of go hand in hand. Usually there's the process of charging author fees, which a number of reputable publishers do this as well, but it's not necessarily done for the sole purpose of profiting. There's usually a lack of editorial processes or quality checks, and often there's an active solicitation of publications. So in 2019, there was an article that was published in Nature that proposed a definition for predatory publishing, and I've included that here. What they proposed the definition should be is that predatory journals and or publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, a lack of transparency, and or the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. So why is predatory publishing harmful? What is the real problem with it? First and foremost, it negatively impacts researchers or the researcher. It can also impact their affiliated organizations, whether it's a university or us here at NOAA. It does threaten the progress within the sciences. So it calls into question the integrity of the research, whether there's anything wrong with the integrity of the actual research that was done because it has been published in one of these predatory venues. It does call into question the science's integrity. And oftentimes it can erode the public trust of these results, especially when it comes to open access journals. There is a bit of, while there's been a huge push to publish more things in open access journals and make things more accessible to the general public and the research community at large, there is still a tendency for people to somewhat question open access things because there is this misconception that there is not a rigorous review process related to those. And another reason it's harmful is it creates this inability to republish these works. So again, even those legitimate researchers and those legitimate studies who fall victim to these publishers, unfortunately, they're most often not able to move that work to another more reputable publisher. So what are some characteristics of predatory journals? Most notably, they have really high acceptance rates. On average, most journals have a rejection rate between 50 and 90%. of the things that are submitted to them. So a lot of predatory publishers and journals will promise some sort of high rate of acceptance. And they will also solicit submissions, usually via email. And in addition to not only submissions, they will solicit participation in editorial boards. They advertise that on their homepage. And I'm going to get into a couple examples later on where we can see this. Usually it's really aggressive. You get a lot of emails from them frequently. And oftentimes this is so that they can get some sort of legitimacy to their journal, by especially when they're soliciting editorial participation. Oftentimes you'll get notification of fees after they've accepted your article. Usually a fee structure should be discussed and provided up front. A lot of times they will do that, but then there'll be surprise fees or hidden fees after the fact. You'll also run across fake editorial boards, and I have an example of that a little later on, where they'll use a fake name or fake affiliations, or they'll use a real researcher, falsify their affiliation, and often the researcher themselves don't even know that their name is being affiliated with this particular journal. Frequently, there's misleading information about publishing operations. So they will have a fake or remote-only location. There is no physical address for this publisher. There's always a lack of transparency in terms of how and where they publish. So what are some things to look for? What are some red flags? So as you're looking at a journal, what is something that should sort of spark that sort of action within you? First of all, if the title sort of mimics an established or renowned journal within the field, and sometimes I don't have a great example of that off the bat, but sometimes these predatory publishers will use a title that just slightly differs from a really well-known journal, from either Elsevier or Springer or one of the more reputable publishers. You'll also see oftentimes an outdated web appearance. You're going to find spelling errors, you're going to find typos and grammar issues, and you'll see that in some of the examples I have. Again, there's a lack of contact information. You'll find missing portions. There's no physical location. You can only contact them via a web form. And that's a very key red flag. Oftentimes they won't have a publishing schedule that's clearly stated. Most journals will let you know how frequently they're published, how frequently their journals come out and on what schedule. And also their fee structures are often unclear or not available at all. I have run into a couple in doing research for this where one page on their website contradicts another page and has two different price structures. You'll also see invented or misleading metrics, so bogus impact factors. If it's not an actual journal impact factor, but some sort of other impact factor, you can't see my air quotes, but I have air quotes, impact factor, it should be a red flag. Maybe it's an unfamiliar metric, not just an impact factor, but just an unfamiliar metric in general. Do other journals use these? Have you seen that sort of metric elsewhere? Another thing would be scope issues. If you're looking at a particular issue of the journal, does one of the articles sort of seem outside the stated scope? Or is the scope that they mention on the website too broad altogether? Is it overly general? Does it cover a lot of really unrelated areas? You'll also see a lack of copyright information. And in some cases, when there is copyright discussed on the page or on the website, they may demand full copyright claims to the article, despite it being an open access journal. So even though they may claim they're open access, they'll say, but people have to have permission in order to redistribute this. Well, that contradicts what an open access journal is. And you'll also notice a lack of information about archiving. or so most journals have some sort of long-term preservation or archiving policies in place, and they are most often prominently displayed and discussed on the publisher's website. If you don't see that, it should be a red flag. Other things to look for would be missing information about misconduct, or retractions, ethical issues, things of that nature. If that information isn't readily and easily findable on their website, it should send up a red flag for you. So I mentioned I have a couple examples. This is one of them. Advances in environmental science. Sounds like a good thing. Sounds like something someone in NOAA would want to publish in. And doing a little bit of research in this, I found that this particular journal is not listed in Insights. It is in Cobbles, which we'll get into that in a minute, and there are 7 violations in Cobbles. It's not listed in the directory of open access journals, even though it claims to be an open access journal. And I was not able to find it in Sherpa Romeo either. So I'll go through how I've found all of that information in just a bit. So within this journal, this is the homepage for this particular journal. And I have a couple things highlighted here. If you read through that first paragraph, there's some spelling errors and there is some real poor grammar. It's a little hard to get through that first paragraph. I had to read through it a couple times because I was like, I must be missing something. And down here under the editorial board, the first person listed, Professor Jamil, it says on their website that he works for Michigan State University. When I looked him up online, he does work in family medicine and public health sciences. However, he works for Wayne State University. Being from Michigan myself, I know those are 2 very, very different universities in 2 very different parts of Michigan. So that immediately sent up a flag for me, knowing that his affiliation does not seem to match. Additionally, as I looked through the site, the second person listed here, Professor Clark, is listed as the editor-in-chief for this particular journal, except he's listed second on the editorial board. That seemed a little odd to me, but again, didn't necessarily mean anything. I did check his credentials, and he does seem to his information does seem correct. However, on his CV, he does not list any affiliation with this journal at all, nor does he have any publications in this journal. And the same goes for Professor Jamil as well. So that was sort of one of the first things I had noticed in this. Another sort of hallmark of predatory publishers is that they will frequently have a notification of quick publication times. They're going to publish your journal real fast, which that's an indication that they do not have proper peer review processes. And one of the first things right here on this homepage you'll see is this fast track publication. And in here they claim that your journal article will be available online within 3 weeks. That seems insane. As the IR manager, I can't even promise 3 weeks to get a journal article into the repository, and I don't have to do peer review to it for it. So that immediately should set off a red flag for you when you're looking at a journal. I was able to find some information about the peer review process, and I'm going to give everyone a minute just to read through this. I don't want to read it out loud per se, but as you read through it, I think you'll all find it's kind of confusing. It doesn't really say much. And you'll notice a few things in there, I'm sure, about authors recommending reviewers and how the editor has final say regardless of what the reviewers say. It just seems a little, we'll say vague. I'll leave it at that. So to compare what this peer review process is telling us, I went and found another peer review sort of policy and description from another publisher that a number of our NOAA colleagues publish in, which is MDPI. And their peer review process is a little more detailed. They included a nice little diagram of the workflow. And I think comparing the two is really helpful to see the differences in how maybe a possible predatory publisher handles it as opposed to a known reputable publisher or journal. So now that we've talked a little bit about, how to maybe identify a predatory publisher or what to look for, what should send up a red flag for you, let's talk a little bit about some qualities of reputable journals. So first and foremost, just like we saw, they should describe their peer review process in a really clear and concise manner. If it is an open access journal, they should be members of OASPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, and/or they should be listed in the Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ. Just because they are not an OASPA member doesn't necessarily indicate a predatory journal, but that should be something that may make you want to investigate the journal just a little bit further. Reputable journals will always have full verifiable contact information. Usually you're able to contact the editors, contact any of the peer reviewers. They will give you a physical address, a physical mailing address. Journal editorial boards listed usually include recognized experts with proper affiliations, not affiliations of sort of similar universities, but not exactly where the person works or is affiliated with. It is possible that if you want to investigate further, you could always contact board members about their experience, verify that they do actually participate with this journal. Some of the other things you may want to look for is, does the publisher have an ISSN? That's an international serial number. It's something that in the US is assigned by, I believe, an office in Library of Congress. Sometimes it would, or if you're submitting to a publisher for a book or a book chapter, does that publisher issue ISBNs? That's an international standard book number. I believe is what that stands for. It's essentially an identifier for that particular publication. All of these are things that typically journals, reputable journals and publishers will have available. So what are some tools that you can use to help you in this process so you don't have to sort of do it all by yourself? I've listed here 4 main ones, and these are the ones we typically recommend, and the library provides access to those that require a subscription. Excuse me. The first and foremost being Cobbles. The library does provide NOAA-wide access for everyone to utilize Cobbles. Same with Web of Science. So you can always check for a journal to see if it's indexed in Insights and Web of Science. Any of those have been thoroughly vetted, so you can feel much more comfortable knowing if it's in Web of Science / Insights, that it's more likely than not a reputable journal. If it's open access, you can always check the Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ. I can go through that process. I'll go through that process in just a few. Another place to check, and I'm sure if you've been on any of the webinars I've done of recent, I push Sherpa Romeo frequently for a variety of reasons. But if something isn't listed in Sherpa Romeo, I tend to investigate it a little bit further. Just because Sherpa Romeo is a great aggregator of publishing policies for known publications listed by journal and publisher. I will say before I move on to this that our reference and our research and reference team has created a really fantastic subject guide that's available through the Central Library on predatory publishing, where it lists all of these tools plus a couple extra ones. It does have a list of these red flags and some of the hallmarks of a reputable journal or publisher. And it also links to Think, Check, Submit, which is just sort of something to keep in mind as you're looking for a place to publish your research or as you evaluate a journal. Is it a trusted journal or publisher? Check there is a checklist available through thinkchecksubmit.org that you can follow before you submit to a journal to ensure that you're submitting to a reputable place. So with that, what I'd like to do is do a quick walkthrough of using some of these resources that I've talked about. The first and foremost being Cobbles. We have two places, or a couple places you can access it through. Actually, the Predatory Publishing Subject Guide that I just mentioned. You can also access it through the library's Journal Finder. It does require network access, so you do have to be connected to a VPN since we're all still remote currently, but you do have to go through the VPN to access it. And within it, let me get out of there and open that up. Katie, can you verify you can still see my screen?
Yes, we can still see your screen.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure before, as I changed from program to program, it was still available. So I'm going to skip around just a tiny bit here, but what I did, as you can see, is I came into Cobbles. This is the home page, and you have a couple options. You can go right into the predatory reports. You can look at the criteria that they use to determine if something is possibly predatory or not. Or you can just go ahead and search. And that's what I tend to do, is I just go in and search. So if I have a particular journal, I can drop the journal title in here. I currently don't have a particular journal, so I'm just going to pick a subject, and I'm going to go to forecasting. And you'll see one option came up, the Journal of Climatology and Weather Forecasting. Based on title alone, that sounds great. I mean, it sounds like something that is within NOAA's sort of research scope and something that our researchers and colleagues would publish within. However, and on Cobbles, they'll show you the location, if it's open access, when it was last reviewed by them, and then it'll tell you how many violations are on there. And this is violations based on their criteria. So when you click on it, it'll open up, it'll give you the rough disciplines that are covered, if there's an ISSN, and when it was established, essentially. And you can see through here the violation. So publisher hides or obscures relationships with for-profit companies. The journal is associated with a conference that has been identified as predatory. A journal uses misleading metrics, so impact factors that are not Thomson Reuters impact factor. Surprise fees. So probably what they mean by that is something that popped up after the fact. So on top of their APC charge was yet another fee or charge. There's some peer review questions. They have publishing practices. They display prominent statements that promise rapid publication. Again, a hallmark of predatory publishers. And then there's a thing down here about business practices. So that's where the emails and the frequent emails come into play. From Cobbles, you can access the journal itself. So we're going to go to this journal's website and take a quick gander at it, if it'll pop up. And the first time I clicked on this, the first thing that caught my eye was this huge banner on the side and up here at top, advertise here. I haven't seen that with most journals, so that immediately sent up a red flag for me. It just seems a little odd that they're asking for advertising right on the site. So you can see it it's not the fanciest of sites, but it's there. I mean, it's okay. I did do a little bit of research into these folks. Their affiliations seem to be correct, but I wasn't able to locate that they had through their CVs or through their professional affiliations that they actually had any contact with this journal. It's not to say that they don't, but I was not able to identify that or locate that. When I came down here and read through the about the journal and some of the info here, it seemed okay, but I did notice some odd grammar things. They do, in a couple places, talk about their quick turnaround times. So just on a first glance, I was already questioning it. So what I did is I took the journal name And I thought, you know what, let me see if I can find some real quick and easy publishing info about them. Like if someone from NOAA was to publish within this journal, would I be able to use the publisher's version in the repository? So I came to Sherpa Romeo and I just dropped in the journal's title. Just briefly how to use Sherpa Romeo. You can search journal title or you can go by a publisher name. So if I wanted to search Elsevier as a whole, I can select publisher name and then put in Elsevier. I'm going to search this particular journal title, and since this is the exact title, I'm going to select exact title and search. And it came up with no journals found. So that set a flag up for me. I tried a couple different other iterations. I'm not going to bore you with how long I spent on that, just for due diligence in terms of starts with, and I took out the ampersand and put an and remove, did it in sort of sections, and every time I came back with no results found. So then I came to the directory of open access journals. It's doaj.org. And we talked, I believe, a little bit about this in the open access presentation last month. I think the DOAJ is a really great place to go when you're especially interested in publishing in an open access journal. And right here at the top, you can search either the journal or by article, because they do index paid open access articles. And I put in the journal title here, and I got two results, but neither of them are the journal I'm looking for. I have the Romanian Journal of Meteorology and Severe Storms Meteorology. Well, that's not the same thing. So given that, I felt pretty confident in thinking, I don't know, I don't think this is probably a reputable journal. I may look for additional options based on that. I did flip through the site again. I'm not going to go through all of that with you what I did, but I did look at the scope, their scope statement, and what that entailed. I did find it odd that they had an advertising section. As I read through this, it talks about how you can advertise within their e-journal, how you can advertise, I believe, within their print option. I've never seen that with a lot of the journals that we deal with, so it seemed a little odd to me. I did look through their indexing. They do talk about archiving. A lot of the things that they are indexed with, note that like Web of Science isn't on there. None of the big databases appear to be on there. So Publons is mentioned. It didn't really fulfill what I was sort of looking for. And I don't really see anything here where it discusses archiving. It just says that it like indexing and abstracting coverage. Well, it's not really the same thing as archiving, is it? So I wasn't able to locate any information about long-term preservation. What happens if this journal goes under? What happens when this journal ceases to exist? What would happen to my publication? Is it just lost in the ether of the internet? Do I have to hope and pray someone picks it up somewhere else? I don't know. There isn't really descriptive information about it. So one last thing, well, you know what? Let's take a look at another example. And I'm going to actually pull up that example I had previously in the presentation, the Journal of Advances. No, it's just Advances in Environmental Sciences. No, Studies. I'm sorry, it's Studies. And this is the one that we had looked at earlier with 7 violations. We'll open up that page just so we can thumb through it a little bit in more detail. But here again, the integrity, publisher hides or obscures relationships. Insufficient resources are spent on preventing and eliminating author misconduct. Same article appears in more than one journal. I will say I spent a long time trying to locate that to show everyone, and I couldn't find it myself. But seeing that as one of the violations was pretty pretty surprising. Publisher uses a virtual office. I was not, in looking at their address, I was not able to verify that that was a real address or that there was any sort of publishing company that was tied to that address. As we saw, there's a lot of grammar and spelling errors on the website. There are no policies for preservation, and again, emails received from the journal do not allow you to unsubscribe, which most places should. So again, this should look pretty familiar. It's the one we looked at previously. And you can see here the fast track publication, 3 weeks for publishing. All of their articles do have DOIs. As I clicked through some of them, I found that not all of them resolved properly, so I wasn't always able to access the article right away. I will say that they were new publications, so it's possible they have not finished that process, but before you put it online, you should probably make sure that your DOI resolves, just something I happen to notice. When I went to editorial policies, this is the peer review process that I had shown earlier. And I'm sure everyone, as they read through it, noticed that, you know, the grammatical mistakes were pretty distracting. There is a review guide, which is for reviewers, but even reading through that, it's sort of difficult to determine exactly what their process and policies are related to it. So those are just a couple examples. Since I'm here and outside of my presentation, I do want to highlight our predatory publishing homepage through one of our guides, through the LibGuides, the subject guides. The reference team has created this. We do update it as needed. We have an option or a tab available that lists a lot of these tools in addition to some other options for checking on journals, as well as a long list of what you should look for in a journal to ensure that it's reputable. And then again, our list of red flags is here as well. So with that, I'm going to go back to my presentation. And before we finish and take questions, because I'm sure we have some questions, I just want to highlight my little advertising section. We do have another webinar in this series next month. We are going to talk about tech memos in NOAA Series, how to start them, what the definitions are, the publishing process for these series, how to obtain a DOI, what sort of archiving requirements there are for these types of publications. Specifically, do you have to send it to NARA? How do you send it to NARA? That sort of information. So that's what we'll be covering next month. And with that, I'm going to ask Katie, because I see the question in the chat flashing.
You want me to read off?
We can go ahead and take some questions.
Okay, yeah. Great. So the first question was from Cheryl, and she's saying, I'm not a scientist in NOAA, but I wanted to understand this topic better. So does predatory publishing mean that you have a research paper to publish and a journal solicits you to publish your paper within their journal and they steal your material?
Not exactly. Usually it's all about the money. They don't necessarily always steal your materials or steal your copyright. Oftentimes they charge you, they don't go through a vetted peer review process or a typical peer review process. And essentially they're just exploiting you for quick publication on your part and taking your money and running generally. They don't offer any of that. I mean, the traditional hallmark of a predatory publisher is they don't offer any of that peer review that's so vital when we're talking about journal publications. They just take your money and say, yep, it's up and it's online, and we quote unquote peer reviewed it.
Awesome. There's another, there's a comment from Gloria that it's helpful to use the Cobbles advanced search using an ISN number if you have it, because that saves you confusion with journal names that are similar.
Absolutely. And you could see I had that same problem when I was searching for advances in environmental studies. I got confused with the environmental sciences. And absolutely, Gloria, thank you. If an ISSN is available, and most publishers put that right up front, you should be able to locate it pretty easily. Uh, Absolutely use that. I mean, it's a unique and identifiable number for a reason.
Great. We
Thank you,
have
Gloria.
another. Oh, yep. And we have another couple questions. Is it possible that
Sure.
different journals with a publisher have different levels of predatoriness? For example, with MDPI, it seems some of their journals are
Mhm.
predatory, but some are not so bad.
That's possible. I have not gone through every single title with all the journals. I mean, that would take forever, right? I could see that being the case. I am not certain. Um, I, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that. I think that's why knowing the tools to vet a title individually outside of just a publisher as a whole is useful. And that's sort of why we wanted to do this today, is just to highlight some of the tools we have and some of those key things you should be looking for. As a rule, I don't think I could say one way or the other. I know that uh, well, in my experience and the publishers that I have looked at and the journal titles I have looked at, if one journal within that publisher seemed to be predatory, I found that all the titles within there that I had looked at sort of showed up that same way too and had a lot of the same issues and red flags. That being said, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that. I will say that sometimes things are not always indexed in. So, like I know with MDPI, I do not believe they are indexed in Web of Science. However, they are indexed in Scopus. So, I think that's one of those situations where you would want to sort of vet the title as much as you could.
Yeah, Jen,
Did
I
you
was
have
going to
something
say,
to add to that, Katie?
yeah, I was just going to break in and say that MDPI does seem to skate that line between being legitimate and having a lot of predatory practices. If
Mm-hmm.
can avoid it, I think it would be best.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think are a lot of journals that sort of skate that line, um, where you don't know.
Mhm. We have another question. If you don't, if you didn't go through the process of vetting the journal and you're now in the midst of publishing a paper in a predatory journal, what can you do? Can you withdraw the paper?
In theory, you should be able to withdraw the paper, because you can do that with any reputable journal, correct? Like if you decide to withdraw your submission, you can do that. That being said, I don't know. You should be able to withdraw it, and I would hope that you could, but it really is a matter of, have you spent the money? I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that either, unfortunately. I think it varies depending on the journal. Do you know, Katie? Have you or Trevor run into that at all?
Um, from what I've understood is if you're in the middle of it, but you haven't quite, given them the paper yet or something, that there is the possibility that you can
Right.
withdraw the paper. Um,
Yeah.
really, most people
I think
discover this after they've already published and they realize, the website's disappeared or, something of that nature happens, and then
mhm,
you're really quite out of options at that point.
right. Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point, Katie. It sort of depends where you are in the process as to your successfulness in withdrawing that paper. What else we got?
I am a few thank yous. I don't have any more fresh questions though, unless someone
Okay.
is furiously typing. I did
Yeah,
put
I do
all of
see
those
that
links
someone
in the
mentioned something about
chat.
MDPI. Yeah.
So yeah, the chat panel for everyone has all of those links that you should be able to access through your NOAA
Right.
network.
Right. And we will make the slides available in addition to the recording. So I do have, I believe everything is linked in my slides, but I'll double check that too. So I might need to resend them to you, Katie, but I'll make sure that everything's linked in there as well.
And I think there's a question about where's that list of sites you can check, and that would be on our LibGuide. So it's
Yes.
the
Yeah.
second to last link I put in the chat box for everyone. There we
Yes.
go. Thanks, Jen.
Which is available if you go to the library's website and you come to research tools. There's an option for subject guides, and this will list all of the subject guides that the library's created for everyone. And you can scroll down, and that's where you'll hit our predatory publishing one. We also have one about publishing and scholarly communications, Python, the whole 9 yards, but they are listed, I believe, alphabetically. Yes, alphabetically. So just another way to access those.
And Gloria also noted that sometimes the issue that journals have is quite minor, and after a while it will come off the Cobbles list, and they will have fixed that issue. So sometimes journals
Exactly.
can change their status.
Absolutely. And depending on how new they are, it's possible that's very possible. That's a really great point. And that sort of goes to this question that Shirley just dropped in about if you look in Cobbles and see 7 violations versus 2, is it still okay to publish in a journal with only 2 violations? I think that's why it's important when you're looking at that to actually look at what those violations are, not necessarily just the number. If it's something like they send a lot of emails and you can't unsubscribe, that isn't, that may not be a deal breaker. I think those are the instances where if they seem to pass a lot of those other litmus tests that we have, I don't necessarily see a problem with that. And again, as Gloria mentioned, they newer journals do tend to address those issues. There is an appeal process. Cobbles does provide an appeal process, and as things are fixed or, let's be honest, we've all found a typo on a major website here and there. They don't necessarily flag something for that. And if they do, usually they are real quick to remove that violation if a publisher fixes that sort of stuff. So, looking at the number alone may not be the best way, but if there's 2, I think it's worth investigating that journal further because it may yet still be a valid, reputable publisher. And again, all of this is in the context of, you should always try to publish where your science is best served. And as within the library, we don't ever want to tell anyone where to publish because you know your science the best. You know where you should be publishing and what the best journals are for that research. But we just want to provide you with some tools and some knowledge and things to consider when you're trying to get your research out to the community. Oh, I'm sorry. Dee also made a really great point that in their evaluation matrix that they use, Cobbles also takes into account if it's a lesser resourced country is where the journal or publisher originates from. That does play a role. So I think that's one of the nice things about Cobbles is you can look at what their criteria is and really understand what they're looking for as they're evaluating these publishers and journals. I feel like it's a relatively transparent process, and they do offer information about appeals and so on. So
Okay, Jen, I see one last question. If a journal comes off the Cobbles list, Sherpa, et cetera, how soon should you trust that journal? Can journals come off and then get back on Cobbles?
You know, I'm not 100% certain about that. I may default to D on that one just a little bit if she knows for sure. In terms of trusting a journal, I really think it depends. I don't want to say that there's a specific timeline for that and how long you should wait before we can trust a journal. I think, especially if they were on Cobbles and they've made efforts to make sure they're cited in something like Web of Science or Scopus, to make sure that they are transparent with their fee schedules, with their licensing, with their peer review process and how that is handled. Maybe you can trust them right off the bat. It's one of those things where you have to sort of take all the aspects into consideration, and really think critically about where we are putting research. Yeah, I hope that answered that. I'm sorry if it was a little vague.
No, I think that was probably the best we can give. And Dee has noted that this is probably a good question for Cobbles to try and answer for us.
Yeah, that's something that we can definitely look into a little bit further and see what they have to say about things falling off and coming back on.
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions.
Okay, great. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to contact the library. Our research and reference team are always happy to answer these types of questions. You can always contact the IR team. We will also do our best to answer any of these questions for you. Again, we have another one of these next month. We will get the recording of this one up in the next few days, so keep your eyes open for that. The slides will also be made available at that same time as well. So thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully it was informative, and we will see you hopefully next month, next August. I think it's 12th. So we'll see you then. Thanks everybody.